right, everyone, and thanks for joining us this hour. I'm Amarachi Ubani in Lagos. Here are headlines. Focus shifts to the global food crisis caused by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The FAO says the conflict has brought many risks to the global agricultural and food system. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson faces tough questions in Parliament today over the government's immigration plan with Rwanda. Plus, the World Health Organization says it's working with partners and experts around the world to rename the monkeypox virus. Well, welcome again, and thanks for joining us. Let's bring you up to speed this hour. We're learning of reports of Ukrainian forces continuing to resist the Russian occupation of the city of Mariupol. Advisor to the city's mayor, Petro Andrushenko, says the city did not accept the occupation, claiming the 2 tow trucks and 3 other large vehicles were set on fire last week in the car park of the Russian Emergencies Ministry. He sent this out on Telegram today. And that post detailed the fatal stabbing of a ministry employee in a crowd while awaiting humanitarian aid near the city's metro. The southern port city was all but destroyed by weeks of shelling and is now at risk of a major cholera outbreak. We're also learning that thousands of civilians, including women, elderly people, and children, are trapped in Severodonetsk with a diminishing supply of clean water, sanitation, and electricity. A pledge by Russia to establish the humanitarian corridor to evacuate civilians holed up in a chemical plant in the city does not appear to have taken effect. Thousands are still trapped in bunkers beneath the Azot chemical plant in the city with a diminishing supply of clean water. The mayor of Severodonetsk says the Ukrainians are still in control, however, of the industrial districts and denies it's been completely cut off, although most of it is still in Russian hands. So the Russia-Ukraine conflict has brought many risks to the global agricultural and food system. Not our words, but that of the chief economist of the Rome-based United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, Mr. Maximo Torero. The FAO Council held its 170th session on Tuesday to discuss the impact of the Ukraine crisis on global food security, as well as on the organization's network. Torero said at the meeting that both Russia and Ukraine play a pivotal role in the world food export markets, and the current conflict between the 2 countries has brought many risks and uncertainties to the global agricultural and food system. He's calling on the world to take coordinated actions and provide economic assistance to countries most affected by the challenges. To allay the impact of the Ukraine crisis, the session of the FAO's executive body, the 170th, proposed to support affected countries with humanitarian aid and the funds for reconstruction, and also to help them to establish a food import financing mechanism and enhance social securities on food and nutrition. China's permanent representation at the FAO said during the meeting that China highly appreciates the FAO's work in dealing with the impact of the Russia-Ukraine conflict and encourages the FAO to closely monitor global food security, to strengthen partnerships and policy synergy to support vulnerable countries and advance international agricultural cooperation to ensure the smooth flow of farm products. Today, however, Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Cavusoglu has detailed a UN plan to create sea corridor from Ukraine for grain exports, saying safe routes could be formed without needing to clear the mines around Ukrainian ports. His comments appear to mark a shift from an earlier proposal to demine Ukraine's ports, a move that Kyiv fears would leave it far more vulnerable to Russian attack from the Black Sea. Mr. Cavusoglu discussed the plan with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in Ankara last week, but said further discussions with Moscow and Kyiv were needed. Mr. Lavrov then said the onus was on Ukraine to clear mines around its ports for commercial ships to approach. Speaking to reporters earlier today, Cavusoglu said it would take some time to demine Ukraine's ports, and a safe sea corridor could meanwhile be established in areas without mines under the UN proposal, and that Ankara is still waiting Moscow's reaction to the plan. Russia says the West has isolated itself, but it is impossible to isolate Russia. Addressing a press conference earlier today, the country's foreign ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova said it was the West that turned down this partnership and cooperation of mutual interest. It has been routinely destroying the very fabric of our relationship. It applies to the economy, finance, energy. Security goes without saying, as well as because all fundamental principles on which strategic stability and security were based have been undermined. Everything was destroyed single-handedly by the West. Her words. She also added further at the press conference today, look what happened to countries that have risen up against the illegitimate, disrespectful, or destructive actions by the West. They were quickly blocked on all fronts. It's just impossible to isolate us, referring to Russia here. But what is possible is for the West to isolate itself. This is exactly what happened. If they isolated anybody, they isolated themselves from us. It is the absolute truth. U.S. President Joe Biden says that temporary silos will be built along the border with Ukraine, including Poland, in a bid to help export more grain and address a growing global food crisis. President Biden told a Philadelphia Union Convention he was working on with other European countries to unlock the grain and bring it to the market to bring down food prices. Since the Russian invasion and blockade of Ukrainian Black Sea ports, grain shipments have stalled. More than 20 million tons are stuck in silos. Ukraine says it faces a shortage of silos for a new crop. And that war is stoking prices for grains, cooking oils, fuel, and fertilizer. Russia and Ukraine account for nearly a third of the global wheat supply. Ukraine is also a major exporter of corn and sunflower oil, and Russia a key fertilizer exporter.
What Putin's war has done is not only try to wipe out the culture of the Ukrainians, decimate people, and commit innumerable war crimes, but he's also prevented the grain, thousands of tons of grain that are locked up in those silos ready to be exported, but they can't get out through the Black Sea because they get blown out of the water. So we're working on a plan to get it out through other countries by rail. But guess what? Ukraine has a system like Russia has, a rail gauge that is different than the gauge of the rest of the tracks in Europe. So we're going to build silos, temporary silos, in the borders of Ukraine, including in Poland, so we can transfer it from those cars into those silos into cars in Europe and get it out to the ocean and get it across the world. But it's taking time. We can do anything. Thank you.
In the meantime, U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has met with the Ukrainian Defense Minister Oleksiy Reznikov in Brussels as NATO defense ministers are set to meet for talks in the Belgian capital. The Secretary General of the Military Alliance, Jens Stoltenberg, told a news conference today that a NATO summit in Madrid later this month is expected to agree on assistance package for Ukraine that will help the country with a move from old Soviet-era weaponry to NATO standard gear. He also said that members of the alliance will continue to supply Ukraine with heavy weapons and long-range systems, and he expects them to agree a new package of assistance to Kyiv at the summit.
Ukraine's soldiers and citizens are doing just that. And they are defending their homeland with resolve, grit, and ingenuity. So we've got a lot done thus far, but we don't have any time to waste. So we're here to dig in our spurs. We're going to deepen our support for the Ukrainian armed forces in today's fight, and we're going to build their enduring strength for tomorrow's dangers. And by working together, we can help Ukraine defend itself from Russia's cruel assault. And we can strengthen Ukraine's security for the long haul. And we can rally together to show that rules, in fact, do matter. And that might does not make right.
About that meeting with the NATO defense ministers later today, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said members of the alliance will continue to supply Ukraine with heavy weapons and long-range systems, and he expects them to agree a new package of assistance to Kyiv at the summit. He says that allies are committed to continuing to provide Ukraine with military equipment to prevail, including heavy weapons, long-range systems, as well as other assistance. The former Norwegian Prime Minister says the summit, which will take place in Madrid later this month, is expected to agree, of course, that assistance package that Mr. Lloyd talked about earlier, which will help the country move from old Soviet-era weaponry to NATO standard gear.
Are committed to continue providing the military equipment that Ukraine needs to prevail, including heavy weapons and long-range systems. I expect that at the summit, NATO allies will agree a comprehensive assistance package for Ukraine, helping Ukraine for the longer term to transition from Soviet-era equipment to modern NATO equipment, and to improve interoperability with NATO.
I have joining me now geopolitical analyst Major Adebayo. He joins me from Texas in the United States. Major, thank you for making it on the program. Ukraine has been asking for these advanced weapons to fight the war against Russia, and we're hearing, the NATO Secretary General talking about, providing Ukraine with those advanced weapons. But Russian forces are still advancing east of Ukraine. It's becoming clearer Russia's on a mission to annex the country. What will Ukraine's European partners do when this happens?
Hey, Marachi, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to be back here. As we kind of see how this whole situation in Ukraine has unfolded over the last few weeks, and it's taking shape, actually, from Russian perspective, what their intent is from the get-go. So what we've seen over the last few weeks is the shaping of the battlefield, and what this battlefield is going to be looking like maybe now or the later. But it's coming to, there's one thing that is resoundingly clear across the board, which is the fact that it's a war of attrition. As you can see, as Russia is kind of re-enlisting and mobilizing soldiers to all the servicemen, as we call it, servicemen and women, to join the fight. And so this is where this whole thing is going to play out. It's going to determine, whoever is going to come on top of this particular conflict is going to be who has the willpower to go the long haul. As you can see, Russia is dogging, and I think we believe, as we see as well, Ukraine is really dogging as well. And Ukraine will to continue in this fight depends on the weapons and the weaponry and the training of those personnel to actually utilize those weaponry against the Russian forces. It's quite critical to them moving forward. As you can see over the past few weeks, Russia has they're trying to have operational advantage in Donbass. So as you can see, it's a war of attrition, economic, logistics, material, and political will. And that of Ukraine is that will is kind of tied up with the West. So as long as the West has the appetite to stand tall against Russia, the Ukraine will be there. So this idea of sending in weapons will continue as long as the West has the appetite for it. And unfortunately, it is what it is. Ukraine has now become a proxy war front for both the West and Russia. And that is what is kind of shaping up right now. So it's a willpower war. Whoever has the will is going to come out. Has the most will is going to come up on the long run. So Russia has the issues of mobilization, and I believe is wearing down on Ukraine as well. How many people wants to continue to fight this fight? So whoever is willing to fight this fight is going to come in on top. But political will, economic will, and all that wills out there. So it's a wall of will at this point.
I hear what you're saying, and somehow I agree. Yes, whoever has the political will, whoever has the will, of course, will come out on top. But Ukraine has been receiving these weapons, from the West. Russia's been reporting it has been destroying some of them at the depots where they're being stored. But it would appear that Ukraine receiving weapons from the West, well, not even just today, but since the invasion started, will probably have the upper hand in this war. unfortunately, the upper hand seems to be going to Russia.
Yes, so in supplying warfare is completely different because supplying weapon is one thing. The ammunition that needs to be fired in those weapons is another thing entirely. So getting weapon is one deal, but the constant supply, logistical supply of those weapons, and that's what Russia has been able to do to kind of interdict those supply chains networks. So as you can see, the global war is battling inflationary issues right now due to supply chain. So is Russia and Ukraine war also has been the issue of supply chain. So getting those weapons from the West to Ukraine is not a problem. But the ammunition, the constant supply of those ammunitions without being interdicted is a major issue. And that is what, not only on the communication side, but on the logistical side, that is how Russia is trying, using guerrilla war tactics to interdict those things and be able to disrupt it. So the Ukraine has to have that pipeline flowing in and out for them to be able to sustain these things. And they're also doing the same thing as well on the Russian side. So like I said, it's a battle of the will. So the West will continue to supply, but the ammunition that is being fired in those weapons has to have that free flow. If not, it's going to be very quick for Ukraine. But as we're seeing right now, there's a dogged war. Everybody is trying, and from what we are seeing, from what St. Petersburg is displaying, how some of those, annexes is going to be incorporated into Russia. All geopolitical landscape is going to shape up in the, in the nearest future. It's becoming quite interesting. So this is their war. This is their game plan from the get go. So annexation is what it is, and we've talked about this a bit. So. It's quite interesting, unfortunately, as well.
Now, there is a global food crisis on the horizon, and I know the leaders are meeting in Italy. The Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN is drawing attention to, the global food crisis, and so is the rest of the world. But governments are talking about mitigation, and that's fine. But before we get to the real crisis, when it begins to really bite harder, what do you think could point Ukraine and Russia to the path of peaceful resolution of this war? Because right now, the peace talks are down. There is no negotiation on the table.
Absolutely. And either way, you have to also understand that what started this whole thing, a lot of negotiation started, hours and hours of negotiation before it resulted into this. When the West was saying that this thing is going to turn into a war, everybody thought that they were just blocking smoke off their you-know-what. But now it has become a full-blown war, and everyone globally is actually suffering from it, especially if your staple is based on grains. Now, there is no concession in any time soon. It's going to happen because somebody has to come up on top. Russia has to save face, and Ukraine, because of what they have global support, also have to come up some kind of way. So there has to be a middle ground in which both of them can either draw a truce or come out without somebody being defeated in any shape or form. And this global war, this food crisis, and I saw what President Biden said about building silos. I don't know who's advising him on this, but this is going to be quite difficult because you have to be secure first actually to produce grains. And even asking Ukrainians to go back to farms and start getting grains is going to be quite, I believe, is quite disingenuous. So as long as there is no peace in any time soon, I don't think any food thing, any mitigation strategy can come out of Ukraine, Russia war, especially when it comes to the issue of, from their output to the rest of the world with grains and whatnot.
Yeah, and even the Ukrainian government says they cannot, store into silos because they have no space. But what they have, of course, will be enough for them. At the end of the day, Ukraine has neither been inducted into NATO, neither the European Union. And this was the reason, why the excuse, not the reason, but the excuse the Russian government gave with its invasion of Ukraine. Ukraine is still fighting this war. Should they reconsider memberships now? I know they already said they will be postponing, pushing back the membership of NATO, but really, have they experienced friendship enough from the West and from these European countries to still want to join them at the end of the day?
This is the case of damn if you do, damn if you don't. And at this point in time, Russia has already shown their card. So at this point, most ideal thing to do is actually get them involved. But I don't know the process at this point in time. There's also Russia sympathizers in some of these. We have Turkey that might actually, do a wild card over there. So some of those things have to be politically managed. But at this point in time, if the West continue this particular purpose and they see that the turning the tide in Ukraine-Russian war is impossible without them being boots on ground. I think the most ideal thing is to get them accepted into the NATO and actually let NATO forces actually assist the Ukrainian forces in turning the tide on this. For me, from my perspective, I think that's the thing that can actually bring this thing to a screeching halt. I don't think Russian forces, I believe, during the midst of this whole thing that the West, as we see it, has overestimated the Russian forces, but at the same time, they will not be the Russian forces right now, without any support from the West, will not be able to hold them down. So the best case scenario for this thing to come out is either Ukraine kind of figure out a way to kind of surrender or find a truce, or the West actually, kind of adopt them into the NATO and then let the NATO forces actually join forces with the Ukrainian forces to combat. And I think that will settle a lot of things down. But the way the posturing is from the West at this point in time, I think they until things change, until they see something that is drastic, that's going to put the Ukrainian kind of sovereignty in peril, I think that's when they're going to intervene, look at some. But as it stands right now, I think they believe that the method they are using, kind of the subtle proxy kind of war fighting in the Ukraine is the way to go. And unfortunately, people are still dying. I just realized that it's 1,300 personnel was found in a mass grave, especially. So Ukrainians are not going to trust Russia at any point in time, anytime soon, as they're trying to do desanitization. So, which is going to be very problematic as well, because I don't know how they can govern these things from where they are from St. Petersburg. So.
Wow, a really grave situation on the ground in Ukraine. Major Adeleke, thank you so much for speaking with us.
As always, thank you, Amarachi.
Coming up after the break. A closer look into the renaming of the monkeypox virus by the World Health Organization, and it says it's also looking into the virus being sexually transmitted. Welcome back. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson today says he continues to make tough decisions in relation to a policy that would see asylum seekers sent to Rwanda. The Prime Minister appeared before Parliament today to answer questions on the UK's latest immigration policy. He said the government had been forced to fight a series of legal challenges in London courts and believed it was ready to deport a handful of migrants on a charter plane to Rwanda on Tuesday night before the European Court of Human Rights stepped in. Mr. Johnson earlier said Britain would not be deterred, and the issue has raised demands from some Conservative lawmakers for Britain to pull out of the European Convention on Human Rights altogether.
A Prime Minister who sounds totally deluded, totally failing the economy, failing to tackle inflation, failing to back business, failing to help working people through the crisis. And, Mr. Speaker, his big idea, go back to imperial measurements. He's got 80s inflation, 70s stagnation, now he wants 60s weights to complete the set. When is he going to ditch the gimmicks and face up to reality?
But what we're going to get on and do, Mr. Speaker, is continue to take the tough decisions to take this country forward, and decisions that are on the side of the British people, Mr. Speaker. They're blatantly on the side of the RMT union barons. When there are some ticket offices that barely sell one ticket per hour, Mr. Speaker, we are on the side of the travelling public. By the way, he hasn't mentioned this, but they're on the side of the people traffickers who would risk people's lives at sea, Mr. Speaker. And we are on the side of people who come here safely and legally. Safely and legally, Mr. Speaker. They carp and snipe from the sidelines. That's what they've always done.
Staying with that story, Britain has pressed on with a strategy of deporting asylum seekers to Rwanda and is planning further flights despite a last-minute intervention by, of course, the European judges grounded the first plane minutes before it was due to depart. The government was thwarted in its attempt to send a handful of migrants on a charter plane more than 4,000 miles to Rwanda on Tuesday night after the European Court of Human Rights stepped in to issue injunctions, meaning the flight was cancelled. But London struck a deal with Rwanda in April to send tens of thousands of asylum seekers who arrived illegally in Britain to the East African country to have their claims processed. The British government says the plan will stem the flow of migrants who make dangerous trips across the English Channel from France. A UN's refugee chief has called the policy catastrophic. The entire leadership of the Church of England denounced it as immoral and shameful, and media reports have said Prince Charles, the heir to the throne, has privately described the plan as appalling.
Madam Deputy Speaker, very similar to those that we experience with all other removal flights, and we believe that we are fully compliant with our domestic and international obligations, and preparations for our future flights and the next flights have already begun. How awful this policy is, while offering no practical solutions. The European Court of Human Rights did not rule that the policy or relocations were unlawful, but they prohibited the removal of 3 of those on last night's flight. Those prohibitions last for different time periods, but are not an absolute bar on their transfer to Rwanda. Anyone who's been ordered to be released by the courts will be tagged while we continue to progress their relocation. And along with the critics of the...
Health issues now. The World Health Organization says it's looking into reports that the monkeypox virus is present in the semen of patients, exploring the possibility that the disease could be sexually transmitted. However, the agency reiterates that the virus is mainly transmitted via close interpersonal contact. Many of the monkeypox cases confirmed in the current outbreak, largely centered in Europe, are among sexual partners who have had such close contact. But in recent days, scientists have detected viral DNA in the semen of a handful of monkeypox patients in Italy and Germany, including a lab test sample that suggested that the virus found in the semen of a single patient was capable of infecting another person and replicating.
The global outbreak of monkeypox is clearly unusual and concerning. It's for that reason that I have decided to convene the emergency committee under the international health regulations next week.
In the meantime, the World Health Organization says it will officially rename monkeypox in light of concerns about stigma and racism surrounding the virus that has infected over 1,600 people in more than 24 countries. Director General of the WHO, Tedros Ghebreyesus, announced this on Tuesday morning, saying the organization is working with partners and experts from around the world on changing the name of monkeypox virus, its clades, and the disease it causes. He says the WHO will make announcements about the new names as soon as possible. And more than 30 international scientists said last week that monkeypox label is discriminatory and stigmatizing, and there's an urgent need to rename it. The current name does not fit with WHO guidelines that recommend avoiding geographic regions and animal names. The proposal echoes a similar controversy that erupted when the WHO moved quickly to rename SARS-CoV-2 after people around the world refer to it as the China or Wuhan virus in the absence of an official designation. The actual animal source of monkeypox, which has been found in a wide variety of mammals, remains unknown. Joining me now is Chairman, Expert Review Committee on COVID-19, Professor Oyewale Tomori. Thank you for joining me on the program. And what no better person, of course, to talk to about this, because we're just coming out of a pandemic, right? Another viral infection that has gone around the world was, first of all, referred to as the China virus, or the Beijing virus, and then the WHO came out with a new name for it. Does it matter really what it's called, the monkeypox virus, and is it really true that its origins remain unknown?
Yeah, thank you very much, Amarachi. The first point is the origin remains unknown. And as I earlier said, if I were a monkey, I will also protest because it was a monkey that first got it. The first monkeys that got infected in 1958 actually came from Singapore, and they got infected in Denmark. So you can begin to see that there's a little bit of a problem. But I think we need to go back into history. Viruses were named initially by where they were first found. And so you heard of German measles, you have of Spanish flu, and you have of Lassa fever and a few others. That was the original nomenclature. And people accepted it at that time. There are other terms, Ross virus, Ohm's hemorrhagic fever. These are all names according to where they were found. That was the original system. But now things are changing. Therefore, I agree with my colleagues that there's need to change the name of the virus from whatever it is they're going to change it to, just like they did with so-called Wuhan virus, some of that nature. However, I need to caution that we shouldn't focus on that kind of thing. We made that same mistake when HIV came, and we spent 3-4 years trying to convince the world that it didn't originate from Africa. Meanwhile, the disease spread all over Africa, killing our people. The people that gave the name, they knew how to control their disease. Now, I think we should focus on what do we do with monkeypox. It has been with us for this long while. I think we need to focus on our own side. What is the origin? Nobody knows it. And if most of the cases are coming from origin from here, that is where our scientists should focus their attention on.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you. I mean, for a virus that has lasted so long, especially on the continent, I mean, it's not an epidemic here. It's just endemic. We're learning to live with it, just like we're living with malaria. But let's go over how the World Health Organization has been handling this virus. Do you think the WHO is under pressure, to push for this to be represented as an epidemic? Because they're announcing figures every day. Of course, the WHO Director General Tedros Ghebreyesus has been making those meetings, press conferences, holding them regularly, just as he did during the COVID-19 pandemic. Is this all, is it really as alarming, as the global health agency is trying to make it?
First of all, what WHO is doing is not a surprise to me. It has happened with Ebola, it has happened with everything. Anything that happens with us remains quiet until it gets over there and becomes a major issue. But I think we have a lesson to learn from there. You cannot get equity on the platter of gold. You have to fight for it. We must continue to fight for equity. And it's not by complaining, whining, and all that kind of thing. That's one part. The most important part is do something about it. What WHO is doing, I think, which is what they usually do, there's a lot of pressure on the other side. I'm sure there's no influence. Some of us also think that the WHO actually, the W in WHO probably stands better, not for world, but for white. And I think until we begin to, we ourselves see it as that, we need to make up our point that WHO doesn't really cover for the world. We have to fight for our own things. And that goes back to our government. Put money in the things that will change, make life better for your country. Those other countries in the West are fighting for their country. And that's what should be. Our government should fight for our people.
Indeed. And let's focus on the virus now. How do we prevent the monkeypox virus? I mean, we've seen the pictures. You have those large blisters on the skin. But how is it spread, first of all, and then how do we prevent it?
Just like been reported, it is spread by direct contact. Somebody has a store, all these pustules and all the rashes you find on the body, they are heavily loaded with viruses. And when they burst, of course, they release a lot of virus. You have contact with such a person, of course, then you can get infected. Now you reported also, now we're discovering new things about sexual transmission. But these are all things that people should be made aware of. It's not just telling us that we have it. This is the way it is spread. This is the way to prevent it. And usually when you have diseases like that, you make sure that you isolate the person, keep him apart from the others. Let the other people introduce their infection prevention and control system. Wear your glove if you're a health officer working with them. Have your face mask. If it's a family member, isolate the person, so that you reduce the contact. These viruses, which are found in the pores, can actually affect, contaminate everything on the floor, on your table, the clothes is wearing. So you want to be very careful. And that's simple. I mean, it's a self-limiting disease if you take care of it. We've been since 1970, I think it was 1971, we had the first case in Nigeria. We had another one in 78. And then now 2017, where it become a big issue. But of all these, how many cases have we had? 500, 600 cases. over a period of almost so many years. So it's really not all the hype that is going on in Europe and all that is because it's popping up in different places, and they are responsible for it. An unusual mode of the spread. That's what has happened. If you keep within the limit of what is going on, it's a disease that you can take care of as quickly as possible, keep the people under isolation, and do the normal hygienic system. And then you can limit the infection, and that will be the end of the story.
I want to talk about the symptoms, though, because I know the final symptom, of course, is the large blisters on the skin. But before that, what else do you have?
Usually, like most viral infection, you start with fever, headache, depending on where you get the infection from. The lymph nodes around the area where the virus enters become enlarged and painful. And then they begin to see, and then sometimes because the virus goes into different parts of the body, and that's why it gets to all parts of the skin, because it's transmitted it's transported throughout the body, and the body reacts with the normal reaction of when a foreign body comes in. So headache, fever, itches at the side of where you're going to have the pulse. And basically, that's what the normal reaction of viruses are.
And because it's a virus, there's no cure. You know, viruses usually run their course. So what could help provide some relief, you know, while one is waiting to become better?
You release the itch. I mean, there's a lot of itching. You don't want to scratch that thing to become big sores. You try to also put down the fever and any other pains in the body. Those are basically where viruses are handled. There are a few viruses, and there are drugs which have been used experimentally, but I don't think they've been used, in a large scale. The vaccine, of course, is aware that the smallpox vaccine tends to protect almost by 80%. And in those days, and that's why we probably never saw much of monkeypox around, because people were all vaccinated. Of course, by generation now, the immunity is waning. We got this vaccination like 40, 30 years ago. So immunity will have waned. Most people have never been vaccinated. So there's a bigger exposure. We're invading the forest and bringing the rodents into our. So of course we expect this to come up. Those are the messages we need to get to our people. And this is the way it is spread. I hear suddenly when people say, do not eat bushmeat. The problem is not with eating of the bushmeat. The problem is with trapping the bushmeat in the bush. You get exposed to the raw material, the blood and all that. Not the time when you get to the bacteria. When by that time, the damage is already done. So all these blanket things saying, do not eat bushmeat, I think is the wrong information we're getting to people. The idea is get back to that raw material, the animal before it is cooked. That's where the problem starts.
Professor Tomori, thank you so much for enlightening us this afternoon.
It's my pleasure, Amarachi.
We mentioned the COVID-19 pandemic earlier. Beijing has reported 7 new confirmed locally transmitted cases as of 3 p.m. today, local time, of course, with all found among those under quarantine. That's according to the municipal health authorities. The Chinese capital reported cluster COVID-19 infections related to Heaven supermarket bar on June 9th. And since then, the city reports a total of 327 related cases. It's launched a 3-day district-wide nucleic acid testing starting Monday for people who live in Chaoyang, where the supermarket is located. Still ahead on The World Today. We'll be looking at how one Ghanaian chef is helping to reduce food waste and feeding the country, feeding the needy in the country at the same time. Welcome back to the program. And what appears to be a block of pure polystyrene trash for humans is a scrumptious meal for the larvae of the darkling beetle, offering a possible solution to the future of plastic recycling. That's according to a recent study. Microbiologist Christian Rinke and his team from the University of Queensland School of Chemistry and Molecular Biosciences in Australia observed 3 groups of larvae, which is commonly known as the superworm, on different diets over the course of 3 weeks. One group ate wheat bran and thrived well, while another group was given no food and managed to hold some weight but remained very inactive. The third group, however, ate polystyrene and not only survived but gained a small amount of weight. Rinke and his team used a technique called metagenomics, or the study of genetic material taken from samples to identify which enzymes have the ability to degrade the polystyrene. The team's long-term goal is to engineer enzymes to treat plastic waste at recycling plants after it's been mechanically shredded using enzymes modeled after those found in the superworms.
So exactly, it shreds the polystyrene, eats it, and then basically feeds the bacteria in the gut. And what we have shown is that the bacteria have enzymes encoded that can degrade the polystyrene. So as you mentioned, what we believe is happening, it's kind of a symbiotic relationship, right? The worm first shreds the polystyrene in smaller parts, and then the microbes then chemically or basically use the enzymes to degrade it further. What one could, theoretically have like a few 100,000 superworms in a big building, right, and let them degrade it, but that doesn't scale very well. So yeah, exactly as you said, our idea is we want to characterize the enzyme better, then reproduce it in the lab, and then have like an enzyme cocktail that we can then use to actually degrade. And that's easier to scale. You can grow bacteria in the lab or in industrial setting in large batches, produce those enzymes, and then we want to two steps, right? First, we want to mechanically degrade the polystyrene, and then the second step is we actually add the enzymes to it to break it further down. I think that's our long-term vision.
Egypt, Israel, and the European Union have signed a provisional deal for the export of natural gas at an energy conference holding in Cairo. The memorandum of understanding is aimed at lessening the EU's reliance on gas from Russia. The Israeli gas is expected to be sent to liquefaction plants in Egypt and then shipped north to markets in Europe. The Israeli Energy Ministry says it will allow significant exports of Israeli gas to Europe for the first time. Ryanair's Chief Executive Officer Michael O'Leary says the airline has dropped a requirement for South African passengers to prove their nationalities by completing a test in Afrikaans. The low-cost carrier's controversial policy had drawn a backlash from South Africans and was criticized as a backward profiling system by the government. Afrikaans is spoken by just 12% of the population and is often associated with apartheid and white minority rule. Ms. O'Leary described the South African government's profiling accusation as rubbish, but says a test has been dropped. And as we end the program, Ghana's gourmet chef Elijah Ado is reducing food waste and is also feeding those in need. He was once employed by high-end restaurants, but today he runs West Africa's largest food bank. Organizing mobile feeding campaigns has become his full-time job, and he loves it.
Storm clouds circled a large zinc shed outside Ghana's capital, Accra, where head porters sat on overturned metal bowls, disheartened by the lack of business as the encroaching rain deterred customers from the market nearby. Then gourmet chef Elijah Ado pulled up in a fully loaded food truck and started handing out plates of hot stew. Eyes widened when he said they were free, and a line of brightened faces quickly threaded the area.
Somewhere 2011, I came into contact with a mentally challenged man who picked leftover foods to feed his colleagues on the street. Just by his actions, one day I was quite interested in knowing why he does that. So by asking him why he does that in our local language, he told me if he doesn't do that, who will be feeding the vulnerable? So immediately that didn't mean anything to me, but reflecting back and on my background and how being a chef I'm able to support myself and my family made me see that instead of throwing away the leftover foods from the hotel where I worked, we could easily pack it and give it to the vulnerable.
In the decades since that encounter, Ado founded West Africa's largest food bank. started a school feeding program, and organized bi-weekly food truck distributions in Accra's poorer neighborhoods. His efforts even drew Queen Elizabeth's eye, who presented him with a Young Leader Award at Buckingham Palace in 2017.
As West Africa's first and largest food bank, we building a model that transcends beyond what we do in Ghana, but as well serves as an encouragement, serves as a platform for other African countries to as well learn and build the food banking model there.
Ado's organization, Food for All Africa, has distributed around 3 million meals since 2015. About 40% of ingredients are unsold stock from supermarkets, wholesalers, and farmers that would otherwise end up in landfills. Food waste reduction plays a crucial role in Ado's mission. Chefs for Change Ghana, Food for All's predecessor organization, found in 2014 that more than 35% of Ghana's food products were wasted at some point along the supply chain. While food scarcity in Ghana isn't so acute that people risk starvation, more than 28% of Ghanaians can't afford to spend more than $0.83 per day on food, according to the government data from 2016.
When food goes waste, it's not just the food you've wasted. You've wasted money, you've wasted storage spaces, you've contributed to greenhouse emission. And versus connecting this food before it going to waste to those who don't have access to food, you have created a means of nutrition, you have saved the money that would have gone wasted. As well, you've created a positive image of supporting your community as a business, as a corporate social responsibility. So this brings into being the importance of ensuring that instead of letting food go to waste, it can be channeled to those who don't have accessibility and affordability.
And costs are climbing. Food and beverage prices were up 30.1% year-on-year in May, the National Statistics Service said, with overall inflation breaking an 18-year record for the second straight month. The trend worries Ado, who says more people with jobs and homes are reaching out to him for assistance than ever before. But he's also never been more sure of himself or of the role food banking can play in feeding a hungry nation.
People can fall on hard times, and I can tell you the number of requests we get daily from people who used to do so well, they've lost their job all of a sudden, and feeding has become a challenge. So they want us to support them and all that. And it gives me that sense of fulfillment that what we are doing is indeed important. And it's part of building a stronger social system for Ghana.
And that's the world today. Thanks for watching. I'm Amarachi Obani. I'll see you again later.